Hi folks, welcome to another fat bearded man talking about records. Otherwise, I'm known as Hedley. I watched a great video last night by Steve Carlson called What's the Soundtrack of Your Life? Where he explained how soundtracks to films very much introduced him to music and allow him to enjoy the films he sees perhaps far more than he would, and I couldn't agree with him more. I'm a big fan of soundtracks. Now I don't have a huge collection, certainly not a huge collection on vinyl, but I thought I might show some of the sort of things that I really like, and I think it might be some stuff that's kind of a bit off the wall, a bit sort of lesser known. Now I commented on Steve's video, and I will put a link to his video below, and go and watch it and subscribe to him, because he's got a very nice style, very very witty guy, and I think you probably enjoy his stuff. So get over after you've watched me and check out Steve Carlson. His handle is Vinyl Community Steve Carlson, but I'll put that down below. Anyway, yes. So I was kind of commenting with him, and I said that there's often a lot of confusion, I think, with soundtracks, because there are, in essence, two types, aren't there? There are the ones that are a collection of songs that were featured in the film, or then you have the musical score that has been composed for the film. Now, I suppose I'm more into the second category. I think they're the sort of ones that really I enjoy, I suppose, because there's a kind of a classical element to the music. Well, if they've got a classical arrangement, that is. And even those fall into two categories as well. I think you have the ones that you really can't divorce them from the film. You can't listen to them separately. They don't really work on their own, but they work perfectly well and wonderfully with the film. And then there are ones that actually you can remove from the film and you can enjoy kind of on its own. And that's the type of music, I suppose, the soundtrack that I gravitate towards. So I think I'll probably start. So I had an early start because one of the earliest, and I have shown this before, one of the earliest records I ever got was this. This is Jeff Love and his orchestra, Themes for Superheroes, on which we have Superman, the Incredible Hulk, Bionic Woman, Spider-Man, the Saint, Batman, Wonder Woman, $6 Million Man, and then of course for the British people we've got Doctor Who, Dick Barton, and Blake Seven on that. And yeah, it's kind of that easy listening, but of course it's in the 70s, so it's kind of a disco thing, and I love this record. That's probably why I put my name on his chest there. So this, I was into superheroes, and I still am. And this was great, and it's a firm favourite, and I love to play that still. And alongside that, also another Jeff Love was Jeff Love's big disco sound, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And around this time, there were all kinds of Close Encounters and Star Wars disco albums. I think I've got another couple of them that I've subsequently picked up. But this was something I listened to as a kid, and some of the music was just wonderful. You had Close Encounters of the Third Kind, obviously. Themes to Logan's Run. What else have we got? The Time Machine. Omega Man. Blake Seven again. And the Cantina Band tune from Star Wars. And I suppose those were the earliest records I remember playing. So the soundtracks were very, very important to me from an early age, and I really, they enhanced your interest in the film, and kind of vice versa. You watched the film, you wanted to listen to the soundtrack. You listened to the soundtrack, you wanted to watch the film. So one of the first films, and I think it was the first film I ever went to see, was this film, and that's Superman, the movie, the motion picture, and the music by John Williams, I suppose, has become totally iconic. And was there anything interesting in the story? Oh, of course there is. Look at that. I haven't had this since then. This is a much more later acquisition, but I mean, for people of my age, I think John Williams' themes to Star Wars and Superman were seminal, and actually they were a big shift in the music for films, because during the 70s, music had started to shift towards a more electronic sound. If you think of the work of sort of John Carpenter and sort of some of the stuff on like the Warriors, which I've got there, and that's in a 70s film, isn't it? Anyway, and so actually, this return that John Williams did to the sweeping orchestral soundtracks of the sort of 30s and 40s was a real retro feel, but it kind of fitted that boy's own adventure, that sort of, those were the sorts of, there's a great documentary I watched about films scores, and the guy talked about how this harks back, well, not this one, maybe the Star Wars one, harks back to the sort of work on things like The Adventures of Robin Hood, that daring do and stuff like that. Anyway, I'm starting to ramble about this. I'm going to get on. So that's, the Superman soundtrack by John Williams. Absolutely wonderful. And I suppose you can't have Superman without Batman. And so this is not the Prince soundtrack. This is the soundtrack score by Danny Elfman. Really cool. That's the bit where I love that bit in the film, in the 1989 Batman, where he flew his plane thing up to the moon and it just stopped and left the silhouette of the bat. And the theme music would go on to be used in the animated picture as well, animated series. Sorry. That's a really nice Danny Elfman. I don't actually have any other Danny Elfman, but I am a fan of his. I think Steve showed the Edward Scissorhands, and that is it's a really great sort of fairy tale soundtrack, but with a little bit of a twist to it, and he does that so beautifully. Okay, you couldn't really, and I think Steve showed an Ennio Morricone, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I'm going to show some of the stuff. This is Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More. This is one I've had for a while. Great. Those sort of Ennio Morricone soundtracks to the Sergio Leone films are just some of the greatest soundtracks ever made. And it's even more unbelievable that Ennio Morricone would not receive an Oscar until a couple of years ago for, is it The Hateful Eight that he did for what's his name that did Pulp Fiction? You know what I mean. So there's that, which is great. It's got some wonderful sort of guitar twanginess, all the sort of chanting that you get. I've also got on CD. That's the Once Upon a Time in the West. Again, another cracking Ennio Morricone soundtrack. I've also got a couple of box sets. These are actually on tape. There's a couple of nice. That's I Grandi Westerns Italiani. So that's his spaghetti western soundtracks from various films. Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, For a Few Dollars More, A Fistful of Dollars, Fistful of Dynamite. They're all on there. There's also another one that I got. This is a 3 set. This one, and that's I Western, which if you look back here, I think that's the same record. And this is the Italian Western. So those are all his Western stuff that he did for Sergio Leone. And then finally, I've got this box set of tapes, which is... I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce what it's called. But this is much more his sort of adventure stuff. It does have some of the spaghetti western soundtracks, but it's also got sort of action film stuff he did. And so moving on to later in Ennio Morricone's career, during the 80s, he would produce perhaps one of his most beautiful soundtracks. to Roland Joffe's The Mission, which starred Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons. The film is a bit pretentious, but the soundtrack, oh my word, is absolutely out of this world. And if there's a tune that's been written that's as beautiful as Gabriel's oboe, I'd be surprised. And the theme music as well, and on earth as it is in heaven. There's always a sense of the Catholic sort of choral music in here, twinned with the music of the Amazon, which is where it's set. And yeah, marvellous, beautiful soundtrack that. If you haven't heard it, you need to. Another beautiful soundtrack, the last one of Ennio Morricone's I've got here, is Cinema Paradiso. And this is a lovely film by Giuseppe Tornatore, and it's a kind of a love letter to the cinema, and this soundtrack really, really helps to elicit that sort of connection and not sentimentality, but nostalgia and looking back to old times. It's set in Sicily in the Yes, that's me. Lovely.
Right. That's it. No time or anything.
Okay, cool.
Right.
Thanks a lot. Bye. Whoops. Sorry about that. Got a delivery. Oh, I wonder what that could be. Right, sorry. I'll get on with this one. I might show you at the end. Okay, so yeah, Cinema Paradiso. Beautiful soundtrack, wonderful stuff. Now, looking more to sort of American stuff, we've got Paris, Texas, which is an absolutely wonderful soundtrack score done by Ry Cooder. So it's all sort of slide guitar, eliciting sort of the feel of the desert landscape in which it's set. And Harvey Dean Stanton does a brilliant song on here as well. So that's beautiful. A real favourite. And of course, something you can listen to really detached from the film. Now, Steve showed Angelo Badalamenti's music to Twin Peaks. And I'm a big fan of that. But I thought I'd show this. This is probably my favourite score, really. And it's not really a score. This is the music soundtrack to David Lynch's The Straight Story, which is, as it says, it's probably David Lynch's most straight film. And it's all about the story of a guy called Alvin Straight, there he is there, who, to see his brother perhaps for the last time, decides to drive a lawnmower across about 3 or 4 states to see his brother. And it's very much a sort of a piece that works alongside the Paris, Texas one, actually, because it's not orchestral, it's very folky, it's guitar and fiddle, and absolutely lovely. One of my favourites. It's great stuff to listen to as you go to sleep. Beautiful. Perhaps a little bit more obscure, a British composer, classical composer called Michael Nyman. He would perhaps become famous for this. This is his soundtrack to The Draftsman's Contract, which is a strange sort of amalgamation of Baroque music, but played with almost a kind of a punk kind of verve, really. It's updated, it's modern Baroque music, and the tune Chasing Sheep is Best Left to Shepherds is something that's constantly being churned out as a soundtrack on television to any documentary looking at a stately home or something like that, where they want to give that feel of sort of the Baroque period. And wonderful stuff. It's very like listening to a modern I don't know, modern bark or something like that. It's very strange. Perhaps less sort of in debt to the past, although still very classically minded, is his soundtrack to Drowning by Numbers. And this is, I should have said actually, the other one is, and this are both films by the British avant-garde filmmaker Peter Greenaway. And for a long time they worked alongside each other. And his films would be scored by Michael Nyman, and it was like inseparable. Other films like Prospero's Books and Z and Two Noughts both had scores by Michael Nyman. This is another lovely sort of quiet one. It's got bits of Mozart in it that he's kind of playing with. And yeah, again, it's another thing I used to listen to. I used to listen to this actually when I was doing essays when I was at university, late at night. And yeah. And finally, Michael Nyman, we've got the piano. This is probably his most famous soundtrack to Jane Campion's film with Harvey Keitel and, what's her face? Holly Hunter. And that's a lovely kind of... My dad knew the tune that he used. I can't remember what my dad called it. It was something like, "Ooh, you are a awful lad," or something. Sort of a Scottish tune that developed into this sort of the more orchestral reworking. That, like I said there, my dad was a big fan of some of this music, and we bonded very much over some of this. He was a big fan of classical music. He was born in the 1920s, about 1922, and he talks about going to silent films, and his love of classical music actually was brought about by listening to the gramophone records and that they would play along, or the pianist that would play along, and he would read out the surtitles to his grandmother who couldn't read them. And so that classical interest that my dad got, and together with film, he did like film scores. And one of the sort of CDs that I got that was very important and we both loved. This is a CD called Cinema Cafe, the European Film Music Album. And this is in the UK certainly you get a lot of I suppose budget releases that are played by the Prague Philharmonic. So they go, because clearly it must be cheaper to record over there. So this is a great sort of primer, really, for a lot of European soundtrack music. I need my glasses for this just to remind myself what's on it. So you have French stuff on here, like the soundtrack to Jean de Florette, La Reine Margot, a couple of things from Jacques Tati films. You've got, I love it, there's a section here of 3 songs called Sex in the Cinema. So we have Last Tango in Paris, is it Bilitis, and Emmanuel. Yes, I think my dad liked the Emmanuel films. Then we get music from films like Diva and Betty Blue, Italian films, Il Postino, Nicolai Rota. Is it Nicolai Rota? Stuff he did with... in what did La Dolce Vita and Armacord, they're on here. Then you've got Strand de Bergerac. We've got some more Michael Nyman, a French film called The Hairdresser's Husband. And then we've got some Luc Besson films, Subway, Nikita, Big Blue, Jules et Jim. Yeah, wonderful stuff. I did a CD of this for my dad, and he put it in his car, and yeah, a firm favourite. And I suppose it put in place my kind of love of European cinema and the music from all world cinema. And so some that were featured on there is Zbigniew Przesner's soundtrack to Three Colours Blue, the I'm not having good luck with these words, am I? The Krzysztof Kieślowski film. There were 3 he did, a trilogy, 3 colours, red, blue and white, that represented the French flag. Liberty, fraternity, égalité. And beautiful classical music, but used in a film context. In fact, this is about a composer, and the piece of music that's in the film is featured heavily on this soundtrack. And actually, my favourite track on here, is actually from the film Three Colours Red, which is I don't know. That's a bit weird, isn't it? Another Italian one is Il Postino. Again, beautiful. This kind of sound reminds me very much of listening to the Cinema Paradiso soundtrack. Wistful, nostalgic, folky, wonderful, wonderful stuff. And of one of the forces, I suppose, that started to sort of get into the world cinema was Eastern cinema. So films from China, from Japan, from Korea. And I suppose that one of the biggest ones that broke through was Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. And the soundtrack, which was composed by Tan Dun with cello solos by Yo-Yo Ma, is absolutely lovely. Again, something that works completely on its own, separate from the film. Beautiful, sweeping, at the same time sort of Western orchestral, filmic, but also incredibly Chinese, with a lot of ethnic instrumentation and rhythms. A lovely soundtrack. On the back of that, I've also got a collection. This is, it calls it Farewell My Concubine, which was a lovely film. I can't remember the director's name. Something like Shen Cage, something like that. And this has the soundtrack. Again, it's by the Prague Philharmonic, so it's a lot of different various things. We've got the Once Upon a Time in China film. That's Jet Li, isn't it? Farewell My Concubine, Chinese Ghost Story, Temptress Moon, Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, and a lovely tune from a song called Red Dust, and that's absolutely wonderful. Again, very Chinese, but then with a reference to sort of Western orchestration and film music. Finally, I want to mention Joe Hisaishi and his film music for... Oh, I'm showing the wrong way around. For Studio Ghibli films. I was a big fan of Studio Ghibli, and it is Ghibli because it's a Italian word. It's not so it's a soft G, not a hard G like most Japanese. So yeah, Japanese animation house, probably well known. This is the soundtrack to Princess Mononoke, which is a beautiful sort of epic score. Again, it's sort of similar to that sort of what I've already said. It has that blending of Eastern sounds, but then in that kind of epic, cinematic soundtrack as well. So that's a beautiful piece there. Also, Spirited Away. If you haven't seen these films, by the way, Spirited Away is possibly one of the greatest animated films ever made. Sorry, Disney. In fact, Disney released it in America, so there was a connection between the two. I do have, I know I've been showing a lot of CDs, so I think I might have shown this before. This is a double album I've got of music from Studio Ghibli films. So it has got some Joe Hisaishi on it, but it's also got other composers. Films like Howl's Moving Castle, The Cat Returns, My Neighbours, The Yamadas. And yeah, that's a beautiful, beautiful soundtrack album, that one, from Japan. So yeah, one final piece, probably my favourite film, and this is one that maybe people are more familiar with. This is Mark Knopfler's soundtrack to Local Hero. Any fans of Newcastle United football team will know the tune Going Home, the theme to Local Hero, which is played at the beginning of all their matches. And yeah, beautiful, really nice soundtrack, folky, not too like Dire Straits. Not that that's a bad thing. No, not that it's a bad thing. Yeah. So if you haven't seen the film, it's one of my favourite. Beautiful sort of wry humour that only the Scots can perhaps do. Anyway, there you go. So, Steve, thank you for giving me the impetus to do this. I hope there's some interesting stuff in there that people found. I'd love to see some more soundtrack videos, because I think that's something that there isn't enough of in our community. Because there's a lot of great stuff out there. I know the Italian soundtracks are a very sort of niche area that people do collect and look to. Yeah. So thanks, Steve. People go and watch Steve Carlson's videos, and I'll be back at some point soon. Right, bye-bye for now. And I said I'd show you what this is, so let's have an opening. It's from Amazon. What have we got in here? Ah! It's Sandy Denny, not film music at all. The acoustic Sandy Denny. I've always kept a unicorn. I've probably got a lot of this on a box set of Sandy Denny stuff I've got, but I'm looking forward to cracking this open and giving this one a listen. In fact, I'm going to go and do that now.